The morning subway was packed as usual, but she barely noticed the crowd pressing against her. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, running through scales and chord progressions while her fingers tapped silently against the metal pole she was holding on to. 23 years old, and this was it. This was the day that would decide everything. She stepped off at 72nd Street and started walking toward the Manhattan Conservatory. The building stood like a fortress of old money and tradition, its stone walls practically screaming that people like her didn't belong there. But she kept walking anyway, one scuffed shoe in front of the other, clutching a folder that held 5 years of dreams and sacrifice. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at her student audition pass before waving her through. Inside, everything was marble and mahogany, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. Other auditioners sat on velvet benches in the hallway, most of them looking calm and prepared. Designer bags sat at their feet. Some were doing vocal warm-ups. Others scrolled through their phones with the easy confidence of people who knew they belonged. She found an empty spot against the wall and tried to make herself invisible. Her dress was clean but old, bought from a thrift store 3 years ago for a cousin's wedding. She'd worn it to every important occasion since then because it was the only nice thing she owned. Looking around at the other candidates in their pressed concert attire, she felt like an imposter who'd somehow sneaked past security. Number 47? A woman with a clipboard appeared in the doorway, her voice crisp and professional. That was her. She stood up too quickly, nearly dropping her folder, and followed the woman down a long hallway lined with portraits of famous musicians. All of them seemed to be staring down at her with judgment. Bach looked particularly unimpressed. The audition hall was even more intimidating than she'd imagined. It was massive, with soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics designed to carry every note to every corner. In the center sat a gleaming Steinway grand piano that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. And behind a long table sat 3 judges, their faces serious and slightly bored, like they'd already heard 100 auditions that morning and weren't expecting anything special from number 47. The head judge was an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at his notes without looking at her. Next to him sat a younger woman with her pen already poised to write, though she hadn't heard a single note yet. The third judge, a middle-aged man with a gray beard, was checking his watch. None of them smiled. None of them offered any warmth or encouragement. This wasn't that kind of place. Name? The silver-haired judge asked, still not looking up. Elena Chen, she said, hating how small her voice sounded in that huge space. And you're applying for the full scholarship program. It wasn't a question. He'd finally looked up, and his expression made it clear what he thought about her chances. I see here you have no formal conservatory training. No private instruction since age 10. That's quite a gap. She nodded, not trusting her voice. What did you prepare for us today? This was the moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading. She'd spent months working on Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces ever written. She'd practiced it during her breaks at the diner where she worked, on the old upright piano her boss kept in the back room. She'd practiced until her fingers ached and her wrists felt like they might snap. She'd poured everything she had into that piece because she knew she needed to prove she belonged here, despite everything working against her. But before she could answer, the judge waved his hand dismissively. Actually, let's keep this simple. Play us Fur-Elise, just the first section will be fine. The words hit her like a slap. Fur-Elise, the piece every beginner learned. The piece children played at their first recitals. He wasn't even giving her a chance to show what she could really do. He'd already decided she wasn't worth his time. The younger female judge at least had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The man checking his watch didn't even look up. They'd written her off before she'd played a single note, and they weren't even trying to hide it. For a second, she considered arguing. She wanted to tell them about the Rachmaninoff, about the hours she'd spent perfecting it, about how she'd earned every single note through sacrifice and determination. But the words stuck in her throat. Who was she to argue with these people? They were accomplished musicians, professors at one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. She was a diner waitress with a dream that suddenly felt very foolish. For Elise. Yes, of course, she heard herself say. She walked to the piano on legs that didn't feel quite steady. The bench was positioned perfectly, adjusted to exactly the right height. Everything about this instrument was perfect, actually. The keys were smooth under her fingertips, perfectly balanced. responsive in a way the beaten-up diner piano could never be. In another situation, she might have been thrilled to play such a beautiful instrument. Right now, it just felt like another reminder of how out of place she was. She positioned her hands over the keys and took a deep breath. Her grandmother's face flashed through her mind. Gran, who'd worked 3 jobs to buy that first piano from a pawn shop. Gran, who'd given her lessons every evening after dinner, even when she was exhausted from cleaning houses all day. Gran, who'd made her promise to never give up on music, no matter how hard things got. "Whenever you're ready," the silver-haired judge said, sounding like he was already thinking about lunch. She closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them again, something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was thinking about her grandmother. Maybe it was the anger at being dismissed so quickly. Maybe it was just 5 years of pent-up frustration and hope and fear all colliding at once. Whatever it was, she knew she wasn't going to play this audition the way they expected. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Fur-Elise floated into the air. But these weren't the mechanical, lifeless notes of a beginner's recital. Every phrase carried weight, every pause held meaning. She played it the way it was meant to be played, not as a simple piece for children, but as the work of a master composer expressing something genuine and true. She could feel the room changing, even with her eyes focused on the keys. The bored energy had shifted to something else, attention. Real attention. The kind of listening that goes beyond just hearing notes. And when she reached what should have been the end of the first section, she didn't stop. Her hands kept moving and the simple melody transformed into something more complex. She was transitioning into another piece entirely. One they hadn't asked for, one they hadn't expected. She was making a choice in that moment that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. She was done playing it safe. She was done being invisible. If this was her only shot, she was going to take it, all of it. And whatever happened next, at least she would know she'd given them everything she had. The silver-haired judge's pen stopped moving. That was the first sign that something had changed in the room. He'd been making notes, probably writing something dismissive about her appearance or her lack of credentials, but now his hand was frozen in mid-air. His eyes had shifted from his notepad to her hands on the keys. Elena wasn't playing Fur-Elise anymore. She'd moved seamlessly into Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, and she was playing it like her life depended on it. Because in a way it did. This piece was everything the judges hadn't expected from her. It was furious and passionate and technically demanding, the kind of composition that separated serious pianists from amateurs. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that shouldn't have been possible for someone with no formal training. The younger woman at the judges' table sat up straighter in her chair. She'd been ready to check another name off the list and move on to the next applicant. She'd judged dozens of auditions that week alone, and they all started to blur together after a while. But this was different. This was the kind of playing that made you remember why you'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Elena's hands moved like they had minds of their own. The muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice took over, leaving her mind free to feel the music rather than think about it. She'd learned this piece in sections 15 minutes at a time during her breaks at work. She'd practiced the right hand separately while riding the subway, her fingers moving invisibly against her leg. She'd hummed the left-hand part while washing dishes, committing every note to memory before she even had a chance to play it on a real piano. The piece demanded everything from a player. Raw power in some sections, delicate precision in others. It required hands that could stretch across impossibly wide intervals, and fingers that could execute rapid-fire passages without a single mistake. It was the kind of piece that music students spent months perfecting under the guidance of expert teachers. Elena had taught it to herself using YouTube videos and sheer determination, and somehow, impossibly, she was nailing it. The third judge, the one who'd been checking his watch earlier, had completely forgotten about the time. His mouth was slightly open, his critical expression replaced by something that looked almost like shock. He'd taught piano for 30 years. He knew how much work went into playing at this level, and he was trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he knew about this young woman's background. It didn't make sense. People didn't just teach themselves to play like this, but Elena wasn't thinking about any of that. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in the world the music was creating. The notes weren't just sounds anymore. They were colors and emotions and memories all tangled together. She could see her grandmother's hands guiding hers on the keys when she was 5 years old. She could feel the weight of every double shift she'd worked to save money for this moment. She could taste the bitter coffee she'd drunk at 3 in the morning to stay awake and practice just one more time. The music swelled and crashed like waves against a shore. Chopin had written this piece during a time of revolution and upheaval in his homeland, and that urgency came through in every measure. But Elena was adding something of her own to it, too. Her own revolutions, her own upheavals. The piece became not just about Chopin's Poland, but about every person who'd ever fought against impossible odds, who'd ever refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. In the hallway outside, other auditioners had started to notice something unusual. Music was always coming from the audition hall, but this was different. This wasn't the careful, measured playing of someone trying to impress judges. This was raw and real and utterly captivating. A few people had gathered near the door, trying to hear better without being obvious about it. Even the conservatory staff, people who heard music every single day, had paused in their work to listen. The revolutionary etude was building toward its climax, the part where everything came together in a cascade of notes that felt like both a celebration and a battle cry. Elena's whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly as her hands raced across the keys. Sweat had formed on her forehead. Her fingers were starting to ache, but she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Not until every last note had been wrung from the piano. And then, just as the piece should have ended, something unexpected happened. Instead of playing the final chord and lifting her hands, Elena kept going. Her fingers found new notes, a new melody that none of the judges recognized. She was transitioning into something else entirely, something that wasn't on any audition list or in any classical repertoire. The silver-haired judge leaned forward, his critical facade cracking for the first time all day. He glanced at his fellow judges, and for a moment, the three of them just looked at each other in confusion. What was she playing? Where was this going? Should they stop her? This wasn't protocol. Auditions had rules, time limits, expectations. You played what you were told to play and then you left. You didn't just launch into unannounced pieces, especially pieces no one had ever heard before. But something kept them from interrupting. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quality of what they were hearing. Or maybe it was something less definable, a sense that they were witnessing something that didn't happen every day, something that deserved to play out to its conclusion. The new piece Elena was playing started quietly, almost hesitantly. It was nothing like the furious energy of the Chopin. This was gentler, more introspective. It sounded like a conversation between two people who loved each other, one asking questions and the other providing answers. The melody in the right hand danced around the steady rhythm in the left, sometimes meeting, sometimes pulling away, but always connected. The younger judge felt goosebumps rising on her arms. She'd been judging auditions for 15 years, and she'd developed a thick skin against emotional manipulation through music. Every student tried to make you feel something, tried to win you over with passion and expression. But this was different. This wasn't manipulation. This was honesty. Pure, unfiltered honesty translated into sound. Elena had forgotten where she was now. The judges, the intimidating hall, the expensive piano, none of it existed anymore. She was back in the tiny apartment she'd shared with her grandmother, playing on that old pawnshop piano with the sticky keys and the slightly out-of-tune middle C. She was 7 years old again, learning that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time. It was about saying things that words couldn't say. The piece was evolving as she played it, growing more complex. She started layering in elements from different musical traditions. There were hints of classical structure, yes, but also jazz influences that made the harmonies richer and more unexpected. There were rhythms that sounded vaguely Asian, echoing her grandmother's Chinese heritage. There were modern touches, too, dissonances that wouldn't have been acceptable 100 years ago but felt perfectly right in this moment. The third judge was scribbling notes furiously now, trying to capture what he was hearing before it disappeared. He was a composer himself, and he recognized genius when he heard it. This young woman wasn't just reproducing what she'd learned from others. She was creating something genuinely new, synthesizing everything she'd absorbed into a voice that was entirely her own. Outside in the hallway, the small crowd had grown larger. People were pulling out their phones not to record, that was strictly forbidden, but to text friends. You have to hear this. Someone in Audition Hall 3 is playing something incredible. One of the maintenance workers, an older man who'd worked at the conservatory for 40 years, had tears in his eyes. He'd heard some of the greatest musicians in the world walk through these halls, but this touched something different in him. The music kept building layer upon layer, until it felt like the piano was producing the sound of an entire orchestra. Elena's hands were moving in ways that seemed almost impossible, reaching across the keyboard, creating harmonies that required her to use every finger independently. This was the kind of playing that took most musicians decades to develop, and she was doing it at 23 with no formal training beyond what her grandmother had given her 13 years ago. And still the judges didn't stop her. They sat there, frozen, listening to something that was rewriting their understanding of what was possible. This wasn't supposed to happen. Talent this raw, this powerful, this fully formed, it wasn't supposed to emerge from nowhere. It was supposed to be carefully cultivated in prestigious music schools by expert teachers. It was supposed to come with a pedigree and credentials and connections. But here it was anyway, flowing from the hands of a diner waitress in a thrift store dress, and it was absolutely undeniable. The composition Elena was playing had no name. She'd never written it down on paper, never formally composed it the way real musicians were supposed to. Instead, she'd built it piece by piece over 5 years in stolen moments between pouring coffee and clearing tables. A melody would come to her while she was wiping down the counter at 2 in the morning, and she'd hum it until she could get to the diner's piano and find the right notes. A harmony would appear in her dreams, and she'd wake up at dawn to figure out how to play it before the memory faded. Now all those fragments were coming together into something whole. The music shifted again, moving into a section that sounded like sunrise after a long night. The notes climbed higher on the keyboard, becoming brighter and more hopeful. But there was still an undercurrent of struggle beneath the beauty, a reminder that hope doesn't come easy. You have to fight for it. You have to earn it. The silver-haired judge had given up pretending to take notes. His pen lay forgotten on the table in front of him. He was simply listening now, really listening in a way he hadn't done in years. Teaching at a conservatory could do that to you. After a while, you stopped hearing music and started hearing mistakes. You stopped feeling and started evaluating. Technical precision mattered more than emotional truth. But this young woman was forcing him to remember what it felt like to encounter music that didn't just follow the rules, but transcended them entirely. He thought about his own audition, 50 years ago in Moscow. He'd been so nervous his hands had shaken and he'd played mechanically, hitting all the right notes but missing the soul of the piece. They'd accepted him anyway because his technique was flawless, and he'd gone on to have a successful career as both a performer and teacher. But listening to Elena now, he realized something he'd never quite acknowledged before. He'd spent his whole life being very good at music without ever being brave enough to be great at it. The younger woman at the table was thinking about her own students, the ones who came from wealthy families and had every advantage. Private lessons since age 4, summer programs in Europe, instruments that cost as much as cars. And yet most of them played with a careful politeness that never took risks, never revealed anything real about who they were. They'd been taught that music was about perfection, about getting everything exactly right. Elena was proving that music was about something else entirely. The piece was building toward something now. You could feel it coming, the way you can feel a storm gathering before the first drops of rain fall. Elena's whole body was engaged in the playing. Her shoulders rose and fell, her head tilted back slightly. Her feet worked the pedals with perfect timing, sustaining some notes while letting others fade. She looked like someone channeling something larger than herself, like a conduit for something that had been waiting years to be expressed. And then the storm hit. Her hands came down on the keys with thunderous force, creating bass notes that seemed to shake the floor beneath the judge's feet. This was the section she'd composed last, during a particularly brutal week when she'd worked 70 hours at the diner and still couldn't make rent. She'd been exhausted and frustrated and on the verge of giving up on everything, but instead of quitting, she'd poured all that anger and exhaustion into music, and it had become this part of the composition, the part that refused to be silenced, the part that demanded to be heard. The third judge, the one who composed his own music, was frantically trying to understand what he was hearing. The harmonic structure was unusual, borrowing from classical tradition but not bound by it. She was using chord progressions he'd never quite heard before, combinations that shouldn't work but somehow did, and the rhythm was constantly shifting, moving between time signatures in a way that felt natural rather than jarring. This wasn't someone mimicking what they'd heard from others. This was genuine creative voice. In the hallway, the crowd had grown to nearly 20 people. Faculty members had emerged from their offices. Students who'd finished their own auditions had lingered instead of leaving. Even the conservatory's director had appeared, drawn by the commotion. Someone whispered a question about who was playing, and someone else whispered back that it was just some waitress with no real training, and the director's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. This couldn't be someone with no training. This was world-class playing. Elena's fingers were starting to hurt now. She'd been playing for almost 15 minutes without stopping, and the intensity of the piece was taking its toll. There was a burning sensation in her forearms, and her lower back was beginning to ache from the way she was leaning into the piano. But stopping wasn't an option. The music wasn't finished yet. It had more to say, and she was going to let it say everything before she lifted her hands from these keys. The composition started to incorporate fragments of everything she'd ever learned. There was a phrase that echoed Bach, that mathematical genius who could make patterns sound like prayers. There was a section that channeled the playful spirit of Mozart, finding joy even in complexity. There were hints of Debussy's shimmering impressionism, making the piano sound like light reflecting off water. And there were moments that recalled Gershwin's jazz-influenced work, bringing the music of her grandmother's adopted country into conversation with the classical tradition. But it was never just copying. Every reference was transformed, filtered through Elena's own experience and understanding. She was proving that you didn't have to choose between honoring tradition and finding your own voice. You could do both. You could stand on the shoulders of giants and still see a horizon they'd never imagined. The music softened suddenly, moving from that thunderous section into something gentler. This was the part Elena had composed in the hospital room where her grandmother had spent her final days. She'd sat by the bed during visiting hours holding that wrinkled hand, and in her head she'd composed this melody. It was a goodbye and a thank you and a promise all woven together, a promise that the music would continue, that the gift her grandmother had given her wouldn't be wasted. The younger judge felt tears forming in her eyes, and she didn't try to hide them. She'd learned long ago that crying was considered unprofessional in academic settings, but in this moment, she didn't care about professionalism. This music deserved tears. It demanded emotional honesty from everyone in the room, judges included. Elena's playing had changed the atmosphere completely. The audition hall no longer felt like a place of judgment and evaluation. It felt sacred, like a church or temple, a space where something meaningful was being revealed. The expensive piano wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a voice, and it was speaking truths that words couldn't capture. The composition began moving toward its conclusion, though none of the judges wanted it to end. The melody from earlier returned, but transformed now. It had traveled through darkness and anger and grief and emerged on the other side, changed but not broken. Stronger, maybe. More complex, more real. The notes climbed up the keyboard one more time, reaching toward something bright and clear. And then Elena played a sequence that none of them had heard before. A combination of notes that created a harmony so beautiful it felt almost painful. It was the sound of every dream deferred but not abandoned. Every setback that became a lesson instead of a defeat. Every moment of doubt that was answered by stubborn hope. It was 5 years of her life compressed into 8 measures of music, and it was absolutely perfect. The silver-haired judge realized his face was wet. He touched his cheek in surprise, finding tears he hadn't even known he was crying. When was the last time music had moved him like this? When was the last time he'd let it? He'd built such thick walls around himself, such firm defenses against sentiment and emotion. But Elena's playing had found every crack in those walls and poured through like light. Outside, the director of the conservatory was already making mental calculations. Scholarship wouldn't be enough. This student needed everything they could offer. Mentorship, performance opportunities, connections to musicians and venues around the world. They needed to make sure no other institution could lure her away. Students like this came along maybe once in a generation, if you were lucky. You didn't let them slip through your fingers. The final chord was approaching. Everyone could sense it, the way you can sense the last page of a book even before you see it. Elena's hands gathered themselves for one more statement, one more declaration. And when she struck those final notes, they resonated through the hall with a clarity that seemed to last forever. Even as the sound gradually faded into silence, The silence after the last note faded was absolute. It wasn't the awkward silence of uncertainty or the polite silence before applause. It was the kind of silence that happens when something profound has just occurred, and everyone needs a moment to process it. The air in the audition hall felt different, heavier somehow, like the music had changed its molecular structure. Elena's hands were still resting on the keys. Her eyes were closed, and for a few seconds she stayed frozen in that position, unwilling to leave the world the music had created. But reality was creeping back in, and with it came a dawning horror at what she'd just done. She'd been told to play something simple. Instead, she'd performed for nearly 20 minutes, including a piece no one had asked to hear. A piece she'd composed herself, which was probably the height of arrogance for someone auditioning for a scholarship. She opened her eyes and slowly lifted her hands from the piano. The room came back into focus. The judges were still sitting at their table, but their expressions were impossible to read. The silver-haired one was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The younger woman had tears on her face, which couldn't be a good sign. The third judge was scribbling something in his notepad with quick, aggressive movements. Elena stood up from the bench, her legs shaky. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice sounded strange in the huge space after all that music. "I should have just played what you asked for. I don't know what I was thinking. I'll go now." She reached for her folder, ready to grab it and run out of that room as fast as she could. She'd blown it. 5 years of saving money. 5 years of hoping and planning, and she'd destroyed it all in 20 minutes of complete stupidity. What had she been thinking? You don't just show up to a prestigious conservatory and play your own compositions at an audition. That's not how this worked. That's not how any of this worked. Sit down. The silver-haired judge's voice cut through her panic. It wasn't loud, but it had an authority that made her freeze in place. "I really should just leave. I've already taken up too much of your time, and there are other people waiting. And I clearly don't know how auditions are supposed to work, so I'll just— Miss Chen." He said her name like a command, and she stopped rambling. "Sit down now." Elena sank back onto the piano bench, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was it. They were going to lecture her about protocol and professionalism, and then they were going to ask her to leave and never come back. Worse, they might tell other schools what she'd done, and she'd be blacklisted everywhere. Her entire future was evaporating while she sat there on that bench. The judge removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket. It seemed to take forever. Finally, he put them back on and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. "Tell me about your training," he said. "All of it. Don't leave anything out." "My training?" Elena's mind went blank. What training? She didn't have training. That was the whole problem. "Start from the beginning," the younger woman said, her voice gentler than the other judges. "How did you learn to play like that?" "Like what?" Elena wanted to ask. "Like someone who doesn't belong here? Like someone who doesn't know the rules?" But she bit back the questions and tried to organize her thoughts. "My grandmother bought a piano when I was 5, she began hesitantly. She saved up for years. Got it from a pawn shop in Brooklyn. It was old and kind of beaten up, but it worked." The judges waited, so she continued. "She gave me lessons. Basic stuff at first. How to sit, how to position my hands, how to read music. She'd been a music teacher in China before she immigrated. But she couldn't get certified here, so she worked in a garment factory instead. But she still knew music. She knew it in her bones." Elena's throat tightened as she talked about her grandmother. "We did lessons every evening after dinner. Even when she was exhausted from work, we'd sit at that piano for at least an hour. Sometimes 2 if I was learning something difficult. She was patient but strict. If I played something carelessly, she'd make me do it again until I got it right. Not just technically right, emotionally right." "How long did you study with her?" The third judge asked, still taking notes. "Until I was 10. That's when she died. Heart attack at the factory one day. She was 62. Elena had to stop and swallow hard. Even after 13 years, talking about it hurt. After that, I was on my own. My parents, they worked all the time. 2 jobs each. They didn't have time for music, and they definitely didn't have money for private lessons. So I taught myself." The silver-haired judge leaned forward. "You taught yourself everything we just heard? Everything after age 10? "I used library books at first. Then YouTube when I got access to the internet. I'd watch videos of master classes, of concerts, of lessons. I'd slow them down and watch the same section over and over until I understood what the pianist was doing. I practiced on my grandmother's piano, which my parents kept even though it took up half our living room. And then when I was 18, I got a job at the diner, and my boss let me use the piano he kept in the back room. The piece you played at the end, the younger woman said carefully, the one we didn't recognize. Did you compose that? Elena nodded, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. I know I shouldn't have played it. It was completely inappropriate for an audition. I started playing and I couldn't stop. I'm really sorry. Don't apologize, the third judge said sharply. That piece, when did you write it? I didn't really write it. Not formally. I don't know how to do proper composition. I just sort of made it up over the past 5 years. Bits and pieces. I'd be at work and a melody would come to me, and I'd have to hum it until I could get to the piano and figure it out. It's probably a mess, technically.
I know it doesn't follow proper form or anything. The three judges looked at each other.
Something unspoken passed between them. Some kind of understanding that Elena couldn't interpret. Were they deciding how to let her down gently? Were they trying to figure out the kindest way to tell her she'd wasted everyone's time? The silver-haired judge stood up from his chair. He walked around the table and came to stand directly in front of Elena, and she had to tilt her head back to look at him. His expression was still serious, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something that might have been respect. Miss Chen, I have been teaching music for 40 years. I've trained students who now perform at Carnegie Hall at the Kennedy Center, in concert halls around the world. I've heard thousands upon thousands of auditions, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've heard playing that affected me the way yours did just now. Elena blinked. That couldn't be right. She must have misheard him. I don't understand. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, he continued. Music isn't about following rules or impressing judges. It's not about perfect technique or prestigious credentials. It's about truth. It's about taking everything you are, everything you've experienced, and transforming it into sound that makes other people feel something real. The younger woman stood up too. What you did today, Elena, that wasn't just playing piano. That was art, real art. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and genuine. Most of our students spend years trying to find their authentic voice. You already have yours. But I made so many mistakes, Elena protested weakly. I played pieces you didn't ask for. I went way over time. I broke probably a dozen audition rules. Technical mistakes don't matter when the soul of the music is right, the third judge said. And you didn't break rules. You transcended them. There's a difference. Elena felt dizzy. This wasn't making sense. They were supposed to be angry or disappointed. They weren't supposed to be saying these things. So you're not kicking me out? The silver-haired judge actually smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Miss Chen, we're not kicking you out. We're offering you a full scholarship, and I'm personally requesting to be your faculty mentor, which is something I haven't done in 15 years. The room tilted slightly. A full scholarship? Are you sure? Because I can't afford to come here otherwise, and I don't want you to offer it just because you feel sorry for me and... We're sure, the younger woman interrupted. Elena, you're the real thing. You're what every teacher hopes to find. Raw talent combined with genuine dedication and an authentic artistic voice. You don't need our training to become a musician. You already are one. What we can offer you is opportunities, connections, resources, a chance to develop what you already have. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't stop them from spilling over. 5 years of working herself to exhaustion. 5 years of practicing until her fingers cramped. 5 years of doubt and hope and fear all mixed together. And somehow, impossibly, it had led to this moment. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, the silver-haired judge replied. Say you'll accept the scholarship and let us help you become everything you're capable of being. Elena looked at the three faces watching her. These intimidating judges who'd seemed so cold when she first walked in. They weren't cold anymore. They looked almost excited, like they'd discovered something valuable they'd been searching for. Like she was something valuable. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. Yes, I accept. Elena walked out of the audition hall in a daze. The hallway was still crowded with people, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright amazement. She clutched the folder containing her scholarship paperwork against her chest like it might disappear if she didn't hold it tight enough. None of this felt real. Any second now she'd wake up on the subway heading to her shift at the diner, and this would all have been just another dream. A girl about her age approached as she made her way toward the exit. She was everything Elena wasn't, dressed in an expensive navy suit with a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her shoes were the kind you saw in magazine advertisements. Old money, or at least comfortable money, the kind of person who belonged in places like this. "Excuse me," the girl said, and her voice was tentative, almost nervous. "I was waiting for my audition." "I heard you playing." Elena stopped walking. Here it comes, she thought. The resentment. The accusation that she'd somehow cheated, or that the judges had made a mistake. She'd seen enough movies to know how this worked. People with privilege didn't like it when people without it succeeded. But the girl surprised her. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said, and there were actual tears in her eyes. "I've been studying piano since I was 4. I've had the best teachers money can buy. I've performed at competitions all over the country, and I've never, not once, played anything that sounded like what you just did." Elena didn't know what to say to that. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I was wondering," the girl continued, twisting the strap of her expensive portfolio nervously, "maybe sometime we could practice together. I know that probably sounds weird, but I'd really love to learn from you. If you're willing, I mean. No pressure." And that's when it really hit Elena. She wasn't on the outside anymore. She'd been let in, not just into the conservatory, but into a community of musicians who saw her as one of them, maybe even as someone they could learn from, which was almost too much to process. "Sure," Elena heard herself say. "I'd like that." The girl's face lit up and she pulled out her phone to exchange numbers. As Elena walked away, she realized she was smiling. Actually smiling, not the fake customer service smile she wore at the diner, but a real one that came from somewhere genuine. The subway ride home was surreal. She sat in her usual spot, surrounded by the usual crowd of tired workers and students, but everything looked different somehow. Brighter, fuller of possibility. The man across from her was listening to music through headphones, nodding his head slightly to a beat only he could hear. The teenager beside her was humming something under her breath. Music was everywhere, Elena realized. It always had been. She'd just been too focused on her own struggle to notice. Her phone buzzed. A text from her manager at the diner asking if she could cover the closing shift tonight. Someone had called in sick. Elena stared at the message for a long moment. 2 weeks ago, she would have said yes immediately. She needed every shift she could get, every dollar she could save. But something had changed today. She wasn't that desperate anymore. She had a scholarship. She had a future that didn't involve serving coffee until her feet ached. She typed back a response. "I need to give you my 2 weeks' notice. Starting school soon. Sorry for the short notice," the reply came quickly. "Are you serious? You're leaving? Who's gonna work the morning shift?" Elena felt a pang of guilt. Her manager had been good to her, letting her use the piano, being flexible with her schedule when she needed to practice. But she also knew that if she didn't make this break now, she never would. There would always be another shift to cover, another crisis that required her to put her dreams on hold. "Yes, I'm serious, but I'll work out my notice properly. I promise." She put her phone away and watched the city blur past through the subway windows. In 2 weeks, her whole life would be different. No more waking up at 5 in the morning to prep coffee machines. No more coming home smelling like grease and syrup. No more falling asleep with her hands aching from carrying heavy trays all day. Instead, she'd be studying music. Really studying it. With teachers who knew things she'd only dreamed of learning. She'd have access to practice rooms with good pianos. She'd be surrounded by other students who loved music as much as she did. The thought was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. When Elena got home, her parents were both at work. They usually were. Her mother cleaned office buildings downtown and her father drove a delivery truck. They'd been doing it for as long as she could remember, working themselves to exhaustion to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. They'd never understood her obsession with music, never quite grasped why she spent so much time on something that didn't pay bills. But they'd never stopped her either, which was its own kind of support. She sat down at her grandmother's old piano. The keys were yellowed with age and several of them stuck slightly when you pressed them. The sound wasn't as rich as the Steinway at the conservatory, and the tuning was definitely off in a few places. But this was where she'd learned everything that mattered. This was where her grandmother's hands had guided hers. This was where she'd spent thousands of hours turning dreams into something real. Elena played softly, not wanting to disturb the neighbors. She played the piece her grandmother had taught her first, a simple Chinese folk song about the moon. She hadn't played it in years, but her fingers remembered every note. As she played, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice humming along, the way she used to during their lessons. "I did it, Gran," she whispered to the empty apartment. "I actually did it," her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the conservatory with course catalogs and orientation information. She'd need to register for classes, choose a focus area, meet with academic advisors. There was so much to figure out, so much she didn't know about how any of this worked. But for once, the unknown didn't feel quite so scary. Elena spent the next hour researching everything she could about the conservatory. She read about the faculty, about performance opportunities, about the practice facilities. She watched videos of student concerts and recitals. She read testimonials from alumni who'd gone on to perform professionally. This was going to be her world now, and she wanted to understand it. Around 7, her parents came home within minutes of each other, both of them looking exhausted. Her mother's back was bent from hours of scrubbing floors, and her father moved with the stiffness of someone who'd been driving all day. They barely spoke as they came through the door, just exchanged weary greetings and started preparing dinner. Elena waited until they were both sitting at the kitchen table before she told them. "I got the scholarship," she said, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "Full ride to the Manhattan Conservatory. They want me to start in 2 weeks. Her parents looked at each other, then back at her. There was a long silence that Elena couldn't quite read. Were they happy, worried, disappointed that she wasn't going to study something more practical, more likely to lead to a stable career? Then her father smiled, a rare expression on his usually stern face. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply. And her mother's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table to squeeze Elena's hand. "We're proud too," she said. "We don't always understand this music thing, but we see how hard you work. We see how much it means to you." That night, Elena lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep. In 2 weeks, everything would change. She'd be walking through those intimidating conservatory doors every day, not as someone trying to prove she belonged, but as someone who actually did belong. She'd be studying with that silver-haired professor who'd seen something in her playing that she'd barely seen in herself. But more than that, she'd be honoring the gift her grandmother had given her. Not just the piano lessons, but the belief that music mattered, that beauty mattered, that it was worth sacrificing for something that made the world a little less harsh, a little more bearable. She thought about the composition she'd played at the audition, the piece she'd built from fragments over 5 years. Maybe she'd finish it properly now. Give it a real name. Write it down the way composers were supposed to. Or maybe she'd just keep it as it was. Something fluid and evolving, never quite finished because life itself was never quite finished. Her hands felt restless, wanting to play, but it was too late to make noise. So she did what she'd done hundreds of times before. She practiced silently, her fingers moving through chord progressions and scales on her blanket, feeling the music in her mind even though no sound came out. The invisible piano, her grandmother used to call it. You could practice anywhere, anytime if you had the music living inside you. And Elena did. She always had. Tomorrow she'd wake up and work her shift at the diner, and the day after that, and the day after that, until her 2 weeks were up. But she'd work those shifts knowing they were temporary, knowing that something better was waiting on the other side. She'd done it. Against all the odds, against all the voices that said people like her didn't get chances like this, she'd actually done it. And this was just the beginning. 5 years later, Elena stood backstage at Carnegie Hall and her hands were shaking. Not from nerves this time, though there were plenty of reasons to be nervous. She was about to perform in front of 2,000 people, including critics from major publications and some of the most respected musicians in the world. But the shaking wasn't fear. It was anticipation. It was the weight of a moment she'd been building toward for her entire life. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the audience filing in. The seats were filling up fast, which her agent had told her was a good sign. People were actually paying to hear her play, not students fulfilling a class requirement or family members showing up out of obligation, but strangers who'd bought tickets because they wanted to experience her music. The thought was almost overwhelming. 5 minutes, Miss Chen, a stagehand said, passing by with a clipboard. Elena nodded and turned back to the mirror in her dressing room. The woman looking back at her was different from the girl who'd walked into that audition 5 years ago. She still had the same face, the same dark eyes, but there was a confidence there now that hadn't existed before. She'd earned that confidence through countless hours of practice, through performances in smaller venues, through failures and successes and everything in between. Her dress tonight was elegant and expensive, custom-made for this performance. Deep blue silk that caught the light when she moved. Her manager had insisted on it, said presentation mattered at this level. Elena had agreed, though sometimes she still felt like a kid playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. But she'd learned that success in the music world wasn't just about playing well. It was about creating an experience, about giving the audience something to remember. There was a knock on her door, and the silver-haired professor stepped in. He was older now, moving a bit slower, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He'd kept his promise to mentor her, had pushed her harder than anyone else ever had. He'd challenged her to refine her technique without losing the raw honesty that made her playing special. It hadn't always been easy. There had been arguments, tears, moments when Elena thought maybe she wasn't cut out for this world after all. But he'd never let her quit. Even when she wanted to, even when the pressure felt like too much, he'd reminded her why she'd started playing in the first place. Not for fame or recognition, but because music was how she understood the world, how she made sense of things that didn't have words. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair by the door. Terrified, excited, both at the same time. He smiled. "Good, that means it matters to you. The day you stop feeling that, that's when you should worry." Elena turned away from the mirror to face him. "Thank you. For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." "No," he said firmly. "You would have gotten here eventually. Maybe by a different path, but you would have made it. Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever. I just helped you get here a bit faster." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Elena thought about how far she'd come. The conservatory years had been intense, filled with more work than she'd imagined possible. While other students went to parties or took weekends off, she'd been in practice rooms, determined to make up for all the years of training she'd missed. She'd studied theory and composition, learned about the business side of music, performed in student recitals that gradually led to bigger opportunities. There had been setbacks, too. A performance where she'd frozen on stage, forgetting an entire section of a piece she'd practiced 1,000 times. A harsh review from a critic who'd called her playing technically adequate but emotionally manipulative. Rejections from competitions she'd been certain she'd win. Each failure had stung, but each one had also taught her something important about resilience and perseverance. 2 minutes, the stagehand called. The professor stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Play it the way you feel it. Don't think about the critics or the audience or what anyone expects. Just play your truth. That's all you've ever needed to do." He left, and Elena was alone with her thoughts. She walked to the piano that had been set up in her dressing room for warm-up and played a few scales, just to feel the keys under her fingers. Her hands had changed over the years. They were stronger now, more confident in their movements. But they still remembered that first piano, the one her grandmother had bought from the pawn shop. They still carried those early lessons in their muscle memory. The stage manager appeared at her door. "We're ready for you, Miss Chen." Elena followed him through the backstage corridors, past other dressing rooms and equipment storage, toward the wings of the stage. She could hear the murmur of the audience, the rustling of programs, the occasional cough. 2,000 people waiting to hear what she had to say through music. She stepped into the wings and saw the piano on stage, illuminated by a single spotlight. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway even better than the one she'd played at her audition. The stage was set simply, just the piano and a few tasteful flower arrangements. Nothing to distract from the music itself. The house lights dimmed and the audience fell silent. This was it. Elena walked onto the stage, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. The applause that greeted her was warm and encouraging. She acknowledged it with a small bow, then settled herself at the piano bench. She adjusted her position, checked the pedals, took a deep breath. All the small rituals that helped her transition from person to musician. The piece she was about to play was the one she'd performed at her audition 5 years ago. The composition she'd built from fragments that had never had a proper name. She'd spent years refining it, writing it down properly, giving it structure and form, but the heart of it remained the same. It was still about struggle and hope, about finding beauty in unexpected places, about refusing to let circumstances define what was possible. She'd called it Audition Symphony because that's what her professor had started calling it, and the name had stuck. Critics who'd heard early performances of it had praised its originality, its emotional depth, the way it blended classical traditions with contemporary sensibilities. One reviewer had written that it represented a new voice in classical music, someone who understood the past but wasn't imprisoned by it. But to Elena, it would always be more than that. It was her grandmother's gift, transformed into something she could share with the world. It was every early morning practice session, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt overcome. It was proof that music didn't belong only to people who could afford expensive teachers and prestigious schools. It belonged to anyone who felt it deeply enough to let it become part of them. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes filled the hall, and Elena felt that familiar sensation of slipping into another world. The audience disappeared. The stage disappeared. There was only the music and her hands bringing it to life. She played with everything she'd learned in 5 years of intensive training, but also with everything she'd known before that. The technical precision and the raw emotion blended together into something that was uniquely hers. As the piece unfolded, she thought about all the people who'd made this moment possible. Her grandmother, who'd planted the seed. Her parents, who'd supported her even when they didn't fully understand. The professor who'd believed in her. The girl from the audition who'd become one of her closest friends. Even her old boss at the diner, who'd let her practice on that beat-up piano in the back room. The music swelled and softened, thundered and whispered, taking the audience on the same journey she'd traveled. She could feel them with her, connected by invisible threads of sound and emotion. This was why she played. Not for the applause or the reviews or the prestige, but for these moments of connection, when music dissolved the barriers between people and created something shared and true. The final section approached, the part that always made her think of sunrise after a long night. Her hands found the notes that represented hope, not the naive kind that ignores reality, but the stubborn kind that faces reality and chooses to believe in possibility anyway. The kind her grandmother had embodied, saving for years to buy a piano because she believed music mattered. The kind Elena had learned through 5 years of double shifts and borrowed practice time. She played the last chord and let it resonate through the hall, holding the pedal down until the sound faded to silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The audience was still, and Elena wondered if she'd somehow failed if the performance hadn't connected the way she'd hoped. Then the applause began. Not polite, measured applause, but the kind that comes from deep appreciation. People were standing, and the sound was like thunder rolling through the hall. Elena stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to hide. This was real. This was happening. She'd made it not just to Carnegie Hall, but to a place where she could share her voice with the world and have it heard. Backstage afterward, there were flowers and congratulations and interview requests. Her agent was already talking about touring opportunities, about recording contracts, about all the doors this performance would open. But Elena's favorite moment came when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, approached shyly with her parents. "I want to play piano like you," the girl said, her eyes wide with admiration. Elena knelt down to her level. "Do you have a piano at home?" The girl shook her head. "Not yet, but my mom says maybe we can get one if I really want it." Elena looked at the mother, saw the uncertainty there, the calculation of costs and practicality. She saw her own parents in that woman's face, trying to support a child's dreams despite limited resources. "Get the piano," Elena said firmly, "even if it's not fancy. Even if it's used. Get it and let her play. You never know where it might lead." The mother nodded, something shifting in her expression, and Elena knew that maybe, just maybe, she'd helped plant a seed in another young musician, the way her grandmother had planted one in her. That night, riding home in a taxi instead of the subway, still wearing her concert dress, Elena thought about the journey from that first audition to this moment. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been guaranteed. There had been plenty of moments when failure seemed more likely than success. But she'd kept playing. Through exhaustion and doubt and setbacks, she'd kept her hands on the keys and her heart in the music. And somehow, impossibly, wonderfully, it had been enough. The simple piano tune they'd asked her to play 5 years ago had become a symphony. Her symphony, and it was still playing, still evolving, still finding new ways to express the truth that music could transform everything if you let it.